I'm Brent Scott, and you're watching the Blitz C&E channel. This is part 2 of Lobe Separation Angle. What is it, and how does it affect the performance on the small block Chevy and an LS engine? Well, I hope you watch the first part of the video because it'll probably help answer some of the questions that may come up in the second part of the video. Now again, I'm going to throw this out there again. This information that I'm about ready to pass on to you is based on my personal experience and testing that I've done. But by no means have I tested every scenario that's out there. I neither have the money nor the time to do such a thing. So these suggestions that I'm throwing out there are based on my opinion on what I would use for street strip applications. Whether you agree with this or disagree with it or how you use this information is totally up to you. Now, if you watch the first part of the video, you'll notice the dyno testing. There's certainly a trend involved in what I'm presenting, and that it may help validate too what I'm showing you further in this video. All right, let's talk about LS engines and my recommendations for lobe separation angles for street strip use in these particular engines. As you can see, there's a list I put up there of engines we're going to talk about, and I also added a little bit of entertainment in case you get bored. So before we go into this, I just want to bring up a couple points that you need to be aware of. When you run tighter lobe separation angles, you have to be a bit more careful with your piston to valve clearance, especially on your intake side. And in bigger cams, you need to check that. Or you might run in a situation with the OEM type pistons. They don't have a lot of valve relief. You may have to do fly cutting on the pistons. Not the end of the world, but you just need to be aware of that. Also, advancing these, you put in a 4 degrees advance, that also will take away some piston to valve clearance. Now, I typically don't run 4 degrees advance unless it's in a situation where you're running a truck cam and your ultimate goal is torque. But these cylinder heads are pretty efficient. I mean, far more efficient than what like the small block Chevy cylinder heads are as the valve comes off the seat. So I typically run anywhere from 2 to 3 degrees advance. Works pretty good on the LS platform, whether it's a cathedral port or it's like LS3 style cylinder head. So the second part you need to be aware of when you run a tighter lobe separation angle is that if you're running this street strip and you want to run power brakes, larger cams, you need to be aware of your overlap so you have enough vacuum to operate them. Now, I'll throw this number out there. It's not a guarantee, but it's kind of what I see. So take, for example, a 9.5 compression motor. You start getting to 68 degrees of overlap, and that's advertised. As you're getting to the point to where you're at about 13 inches of vacuum. You're on that edge to where you're not going to have enough vacuum to operate your brakes. Now, if you have an LS3 where you have a bit more compression, it gets a little bit better. Then you might be able to run up to 72 degrees of overlap before you start running into problems with the vacuum operating your brakes. Again, it's not a guarantee, but it's a factor you should consider, and hopefully it'll help you out from picking a cam that's too big for you. So let's roll into our lobe separation angles. The first one on the list is your 4.8 liter. So if you're running it as in a truck application and you're putting a smaller cam in there, you can run a 109. But generally, a 110 is probably going to be the sweet spot on that particular engine. Certainly if you're still running the 1.89 intake valve on there. Now your 5.3 liter. The 107 definitely seems to be the sweet spot in that particular engine. Now, if you upgrade the heads and you put a 2-inch valve in there, I would target a 108 lobe separation angle on that engine. So the 5.7 liter, like the LS1 motor, they're not as common anymore, but if you're running it and you have the standard 2-inch valve in there, I would target a 108 LSA on that engine. Your 6 liters, there's 2 scenarios in here. So whether you have the cathedral port head or you have like a newer LS3 head that's been put on there, if you're with the cathedral port and you're running the 2-inch valve on there, I would run a 107 on that. Now, if you upgrade to an LS3 head with a 2165, then a 108 would be your ideal target on that engine. Your 6.2 liter. So there's 2 situations here. 109 is sometimes works on a 6.2. There's times that I've done it, but generally the 108 is overall 97% of the time is the sweet spot on that engine. Certainly if you're running with a 2165 intake valve. And that even works well even in your stroker setups from up to 402 to 415. Now, your 7-liter stuff, your LS7, or if you're building like a 427 or 428, and then up to a 454. Now, if you're closer to a 427, I typically shoot for a 107 in my stuff. So if you're building a bigger cubic inch motor like a 454 or so, you should consider having a cam ground on a 106 lobe separation angle for that particular application. So this is the end of this part of the video on my recommendations for street strip use lobe separation angles on the LS platform. But one other thing I want to add to this, most of these engines that I've quoted on would be running in the 9.5 to 11:1 compression. But for example, if you happen to have one of these engines and you bump up a point on the compression, or another situation is if you change the rocker ratio from, let's say, a 1.7 to 1.8 ratio, you should consider adding 1 point onto the lobe separation angle that I recommend. Because the engine is becoming more efficient, you don't need to be on as tight of a lobe separation angle. But again, as long as you get yourself within these target lobe separation angles that I've given, plus or minus a point, you're still going to have a pretty good performing engine. Small block Chevy and my recommendations on lobe separation angles for street strip use. Now, I'm assuming most of you guys are running 10.5 compression on these. Cam swaps are probably not as popular like the LS stuff. I imagine most of you guys are doing a complete rebuild, and you're putting in aftermarket pistons that have valve reliefs put into the pistons. But let's say, for example, since you guys that watch this channel are TPI guys, if you happen to have, you're doing a TPI motor that doesn't have 1 billion miles on it, and you just do a cam swap and you run stock pistons, you do want to pay attention to your piston to valve clearance, because tighter lobe separation angles will make the intake side tighter. So you want to shoot for 80 thousandths clearance on the intake and 100 thousandths on your exhaust to be on the safe side. And if you upsize the valves, pay attention to the radius as well, that there's enough clearance in that. So first one on the list, a 305. Now I don't know why you really want to rebuild the 305, considering 350 diamond doesn't, but let's say you're a TPI guy and you have this beautiful Firebird and you want to keep the car with the original motor in there, but you want to give it some giddy up. So you have a 305. Now, if you had the stock head and you're running a 1.84 intake valve, then you would want to target a 109 lobe separation angle for that particular setup. If you up the intake valve on maybe that thing, then you may want to consider a 110. 350. All right, so I put down two different numbers, 107, 108. So typically, most 350s, you're building with a 202 valve in there. So your 108 is going to be your go-to. But let's say you're a TPI guy and you're keeping the stock head that has the 1.94 valve. And even if you bump it up to a 2-inch valve, a 107 would be your ideal target for that situation. 383. All right, I've done a few of these, and I put two different ones on there. So these work pretty well. If you have a 202 valve and a 383, then you can shoot for a 106 lobe separation angle. If you're running a 205 intake valve, then I would shoot for a 107 lobe separation angle. Now I listed 400 small block Chevy on here. I don't know how popular this is, or what, even if you find them. I mean, if you do, it's probably custom built. And you probably would want to use bigger valves on this, but let's just say you have a 400 small block Chevy, you found a decent block, and you're putting a 202 valve on it, ahead with a 202. You'd want to shoot for a 107 lobe separation angle on that. And even if you bump to a 2-inch 205, you would still want to stay with a 107. Now, if you put a 280 valve on there, then you'd want to look at a 108. And bigger valve than that, you'd probably still want to shoot for a 108 lobe separation angle. So in the video before this on the LS, I brought up the point about adjusting your lobe separation angle. And I'll mention this in this particular video. So for example, most of these engines and the configurations I set up for on here are using a 1.6 rocker arm ratio. But let's say, for example, if you bump up a point in compression or you go to like a 1.7 rocker arm ratio, then you may want to consider adding 1 point higher on these recommended lobe separation angles, because the engine, again, is becoming more efficient. With these changes, you can actually reduce by about 1 point the lobe separation angle. But again, like I said in the previous video, if you get yourself within a point plus or minus of these recommended lobe separation angles, you're still going to have a pretty good performing engine. Power adders and lobe separation angles for superchargers and turbos. Now, if you made it all the way to this point in the video, all the information that I gave and recommendations prior to this, I want you to throw all that information out, because that information is based on naturally aspirated setups. But when it comes to power adders like superchargers and turbos, this is a situation where you don't want to run tighter lobe separation angles that add overlap. And the problem with overlap, there's two things that happen. And the first one is kind of obvious. When you open up the intake valve and the exhaust valve is still open, because of the added boost and pressure, you end up dumping good fuel and air right through the exhaust. The other problem with it that you can run into is you can get false readings of being too rich when the actual reality is you're running too lean on the engine. So the thing here is, whatever you might gain from this overlap, honestly, you need to focus on the efficiency of the turbo and superchargers. Because whatever might be gained from the overlap will be pretty much negated from having a more efficient turbo or supercharger. Now, I did list some baseline lobe separation angles up on the screen for superchargers and turbos, what I typically see in cams. But honestly, this video is kind of for you street strip guys. A lot of you guys could probably take your OEM cams that don't have overlap dialed into them and use those cams on your power adder setup and build a pretty successful setup. But if you're looking to build something a little bit more exotic or more powerful, at that point I would search out someone that's already built something similar to what you're wanting to build, or find guys that they just strictly do superchargers and turbo stuff, and then ask them for recommendations on what the ideal lobe separation angle should be for the setup that you want to build. Now, I suspect there probably is an ideal lobe separation angle for every scenario, even with superchargers, power adders, your level of boost, your displacement, and all that. But to be honest with you, I'm an NA guy, and unless I did, like extensive testing, found the trends, tested the trends to death, then validated them through formulas, I don't even want to guess, because all it would be is guessing if I gave anything more than what I put up here. So at this point in the video, I'm going to end it here. Now, TPI guys, I know I said I was going to do a section on cam specs for you guys. I've decided just to do a separate video all on that subject by itself. So you're welcome to leave comments below, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Again, I appreciate you watching the video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.